Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Eddie, for the nice introduction. Let me just start by saying thank you to the ABLE board. Tracy, thank you for the invitation. We talked on the phone, I want to say 6 months ago when we first discussed the conference and the purpose of it and the goals and all that. Thank you to the ABLE board, half of which are my friends personally, so it's good to see smiling faces in the audience. I feel like I'm talking to a group of friends, honestly. I like this size conference as a place where you can actually see the same people after the session, and I hope to go to at least one or two of them before I have to leave. So happy to be here. It's my first time at Bronx Community College, my first time going to City Island last night for dinner. Haven't actually been to this part of New York City in a long time, maybe like 20 years. I had family who lived there, and so we visited for one weekend, and it was a great time, but just really happy to be back. By show of hands, did any of you go to the AAC&U General Assessment meeting in San Francisco? Of course, Terry, I know that you were there. Anybody go to AALHE? Okay, Terry, you were there too. So basically Terry is going everywhere that I'm going. I asked those because I think I talked to Susan last night at dinner, and she said, Amelia, I've seen your name a number of places. It seems like you're everywhere, and I'm happy to be everywhere. But in case you had gone to either of those conferences, you'd probably know that this presentation is going to be heavily focused on students, and specifically the value proposition for anything that we're doing in co-curricular or classroom spaces for them. So the destination will be the same, but the path and the driving route will be different from that at LHE and AAC&U. But just the disclaimer that I lean very heavily toward the who are we doing this for, what would they get out of it, what's the purpose of all of what we're doing. So that being said, I created one of those lengthy titles with the colon that you mentioned last night where you're looking up things. So it's a conversation at dinner about why presentation titles and chapters have a colon in there. So like every one of those, I called it Collaboration as a Lever for Change, New Partnerships, Relationships, and Priorities. And so I have a lot to say, but here's the agenda for how I'll do it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about NASPA. I'm going to tell you some things about myself that are not in my bio. So you probably heard research. There are things that I like to do when I'm not doing that type of stuff. I'm going to share some current trends as I see them in the area of experiential learning. From there, I'm going to describe some challenges and opportunities that I've seen that kind of overlay or describe the current condition of trends in experiential learning. Then I'm going to share an airplane story that kind of ties a little bit of this together and sets up a conversation about the 3 critical student-focused actions that I think we should keep in mind. I'll predict the future a little bit, although my predictions won't be super lofty. They won't be precise with an actual year and date and time and stuff, but things that I think will actually happen. I'll leave you with some resources, and then hopefully after all of this, about 45 minutes or so, if you all have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. It's like every presenter's dream to have at least one person in the audience want to know something. Okay, these are things that are not in my bio. So I love connecting people. I also like connecting ideas. And so if I've met you at one place or another, and at some time you say, hey, Amelia, I really enjoyed what you had to say about this ePortfolio experience at Stanford, for example. I say, well, do you know Helen Chin? If you say no, I'm going to say, I should introduce you. So I really like doing that type of stuff. I eat ice cream almost every day. And I used to say I eat it every day until somebody challenged me and said, hey, it's 11 p.m., have you had the ice cream? I was like, I wanted to, but I didn't have time to. But I eat it every day. I'm not afraid to try and fail. And so if you see that picture at the bottom left, that's me and my twin sister at the zoo in Dallas. I don't know which of the twins I am because that was before the dating and labeling of pictures. That's actually the photograph that I took a picture of. But I do have a good feeling that's me trying to pick up that goat that's over there, right? And why, I don't know what purpose, what for, but that does describe a little of my personality. So probably say about a year ago, I decided that I want to try and cut my own hair. I got tired of trying to find a local stylist. I was in a pinch. That's not the picture of me after the hairstylist. It didn't go well at all. It's funny that we're talking about experience being a good teacher. I believe that it is. It also taught me that I should respect the work of hairstylists and go to them and let them do it, which is what happened afterwards. So also, connect this last point. I know a lot of airplane stories. So if you just have a random moment, if you catch me in the hall, I can tell you some things that would probably make you either laugh or cringe. But there's an airplane story that I'm going to share in this segment a little bit later on. So let me get on to the point. I must have left the About NASPA slide. I did leave the, well, I guess we don't need an About NASPA slide because Eddie told you, but what I can tell you about NASPA, aside from us being about 16,000 members individually across the country, across several other countries, is that we're in a place now where a lot of student affairs professionals are asking the question, how do we know what we feel like we already knew a long time ago, but how can we show with evidence that when students do things like study abroad or service learning or leadership activities or clubs and activities, that they're actually learning things. And so a lot of the momentum momentum lately has been around finding rubrics, finding frameworks, finding places where learning outcomes can be intentionally connected across classroom and co-curricular spaces. And so it's for that reason that I think this is the perfect time for us to be discussing e-portfolios as a method by which we would do some of this stuff. So here's what I see as current trends in experiential learning. So student affairs and academic affairs. And there are a lot of other collaborations too. So if you think the registrar and information technology and IT, for example, a lot of momentum right now around this idea that there has to be a team of professionals all working together because they want to create something. So it might be, in best case scenario, an e-portfolio. In a little bit lesser capacity, you probably heard the movement toward badges or other micro-credentials. I just like the idea that there are going to be a number of professionals at this phase saying we have to work together to do this. As a result, there are new audiences that are interested. So I probably put at the top of the list accrediting bodies. Now, maybe not right now, but I find that a lot of institutions have told me that they're doing more intentional work around learning outcomes because they want to show to accreditors that it's actually happening. So we're in New York. I couldn't help but mention the SUNY Applied Learning Initiative. So they've been doing that for several years. I imagine a lot of those institutions would be collecting artifacts and putting together the narrative about how integrated or holistic learning is happening all over the campus. And so that also leads to my point about integration. And so specifically the integrated nature of learning, but then also the integration of systems. I imagine if any of you have started to use an e-portfolio, you probably run across that question related to technology integration. How are you going to be connecting what you want to put into the e-portfolio with what you might already have in your student information system? So Banner or PeopleSoft or Jenzabar, one of those. And then lastly, if you think about the impact of all this, I'd say that we're in a period of great expansion. There are a lot of students now who previously might not have considered doing things outside the classroom, but they are now. I think the external things that we can't really control, like the rising cost to attend college, has pushed many more students to say, if I'm going to be here and spend this much money, how can I carve out at least a little bit of time to intentionally do this work so it set me up for a career, or it might actually just give me more bang for my buck. I hate to make it that tactical, but that's what I hear a lot. And then lastly, there's a continuing conversation about the distinction between immersion and exposure. So I'd say in the student affairs space, it's not required that students have to participate in clubs and activities. So some would say, what about exposure? What if I just sat with a group of people from Able and we sat for an hour and we talked about the future of higher education? Could that count? Could that go into my e-portfolio? Some might say yes. Others might say, if we had that meeting 10 times in a semester and we had artifacts that would show what we actually discussed and we had evidence of our learning and reflection papers, then we should count it. So I find that continuum between exposure all the way up to immersion is going to continue to rise about, and I think we're going to have more intentional conversations about it in the future. So as a result, I see 5 specific current trends that relate to those 4 broader buckets. And so we've done a lot of work. I'll have a shameless plug at the end related to creating a comprehensive learner record. So the idea is that when a student goes to a campus from freshman year to however long they stay, if it's just 1 year all the way up to 4 or 5 or 6, that they would have several options for documenting learning. Okay, that seems timely since we're here for the e-portfolio discussion. The second I would say is that there's a continued narrative, one that you've probably seen in the headlines or you've been in a table conversation with family, but someone's going to say that employers are asking for colleagues that can effectively demonstrate that they have a variety of transferable skills. I don't think they're called soft skills. I think transferable would probably be more appropriate. They're not necessarily soft because it's hard to attain them. You know, if you find someone who can communicate well or write effectively, that takes a while to build those types of skills. But employers seek them, colleagues seek them, graduate schools seek them, we all seek them. The third is that I think institutions are starting to intentionally design systems and processes, or implement processes, that are going to connect learning outcomes all over the place. And so I had a great invitation to go to Vermont for the first time for the AAC&U Institute on General Education. And it was at that time that I got to talk with a lot of campuses that said, we have not updated our general learning outcomes in a good while, but this is the time we really want to do it. We don't want to just create new learning outcomes. We want to figure out the process and a system to sustain those learning outcomes. And that was a really great set of conversations. And I think if they do that well, it leads to number 4, this notion of evidence. And I think I'll give some points at the end about why the culture of assessment doesn't need to be scary, but sometimes it does make people a little nervous. The idea that if you're a state system, your state legislature might ask you for evidence, your accreditor might ask you for evidence, your president might ask you for evidence, the VP might ask you for evidence. And with that type of overlay of the discussion, it feels like it's very punitive if you can't really produce what you like. But instead, I'd say that learning is still happening everywhere, so it creates a great opportunity to show students, number 5, the value that comes from the variety of experiences that we provide to them. So I could probably have made this list twice as long, but I think this is the current situation that we're in. And as a result, I'm going to start with the not so positive and end on the positive. I did red for not good, and then green is going to be, better. So I get teased all the time about my slides not being the most fancy, but I think these red dots and green dots, kind of put me there. It's my first time using them. I think I'm going to go with it. So this picture I put up here, because it represents what I see a lot. Somebody who's always reminding you of the time, and then somebody who's always looking at the time, but a little bit nervous and just, this is where we are. So I find that a lot of campuses are still struggling to find the balance of depth and breadth. So we want to offer a whole lot of opportunities. We don't want anybody to be left out. But if we offer everything to everybody, how do we go, again, from exposure all the way to immersion? So that's a difficult thing to wrestle with. The second is the strategic use and management of technology and data and other resources, things that we know we need to have in order for an ePortfolio or other effort to work, but it's not always a turnkey situation. So I know that fortunately we have Digication here. They're going to solve all of our problems for us, I imagine. But even in a system like that, after a couple of years, you'd have to update that, or maybe the person who normally manages that system leaves. How do you find the transfer of information and technology to be most effective for what you're trying to do? And then lastly, assume that we cover both of those. Let's say we find the balance between depth and breadth. Let's say we find the technology solution and the data that flows out of it is collected well, analyzed effectively. At some point, we want to scale this. We want to have the mushroom effect. We want to have every student be able to do this. And so I think I really like that the ethics conversation is going to be a part of this conference agenda. I know that part of the conversation will always be about equity and how to make sure all students have an opportunity to do it at the same level. But we haven't figured that out yet. But here's the good news, my green dots are here. So I don't want to just bore you with all the bad stuff. This presents a great opportunity for collaboration. So across all student-focused functions, and I can't think of too many that are not student-focused or even student-touched at some point, there's great collaboration that can happen throughout this whole process. So ePortfolios, I understand exactly why it could be the 11th high-impact practice, because to make something like that work, you have to have the types of integration of functions and roles that I described on an earlier slide. The second is that it's a great connection to the institutional brand and mission. So walking over here, if you remember seeing those signs for CUNY ASAP, I imagine, if I dream big enough, that a campus's ePortfolio initiative would be the same type of effect, that part of the mission of your institution should be visible. It should be obvious to anybody who comes to the campus that this is something that you're committed to. And then lastly, I think by doing those two things, students can see the tangible resource that they have, and it finds to be more valuable to them. So again, I could probably make a longer list of opportunities, but I got to keep going. So I have 3 critical student-focused actions, 3 things that I think, if I were to talk with you for another 35 minutes or so, that I think we should keep in mind. These are bottom shelf. These are not like, sophisticated things, but things that I think if you were to frame out a conversation with colleagues about why this is the time for ePortfolios to be strengthened and leveraged, I said the first is that it helps students tell their story. I've oftentimes heard ePortfolios described as the tool, as the resource, as something to procure and to implement. But instead, I really see it as the lever by which advising can happen. So career advisors could use it, academic advisors could use it, but the end result is that students are actually becoming more fluent in their own story and how to tell it in a variety of settings. The second is that we have tremendous opportunity to connect intentionally activities that happen outside the classroom with things they're learning inside the classroom. And then the third, which I put in bold, is the work-based opportunities. I know that especially at a commuter institution or an institution that serves a number of students who are going back to college and have to work at the same time, there's a lot of untapped potential. If you've heard me talk before, I mentioned before that the on-campus student employment movement is going to be like the next big thing. I think it's already here. It's not a new initiative. It's a great opportunity for us. So I got some new data to share with you from some research that we've done on that topic. And then lastly, I kind of said this again, I think in order to do this effectively, to communicate early and often about why this really works and why it makes a difference is my third critical student-focused action. So speaking of which, here's number 1. I titled the keynote Relationships, Partnerships, and Priorities. And so if I'm saying that we want to use them to help students tell their story, the actual relationship in this partner. So I don't know that everybody will have a chance to talk with a student about their ePortfolio, but I can imagine career advisors, academic advisors, faculty, and probably someone else who's working in student affairs. So there's a relationship there. If you imagine how many times you might expect a student to talk with somebody about the progress they're making in their whole college experience, there's going to be a couple opportunities for them to routinely discuss the ePortfolio. If done intentionally, it could work out. That requires a partnership between advisors and faculty. We want to make sure we're not confusing students. So if a faculty member tells a student that they should be making certain progress toward artifacts and populating the ePortfolio, we would hope that that same narrative would carry out outside the classroom as well. And again, to reiterate 3-4 times over, the priority here is on the learner, to help them find their personal narrative and to be able to carry it out regardless of which faculty or professional they have actually been engaging with. All right, so here is my first audience poll. If you have ability by raising your hand, have you ever had a good conversation with a stranger while traveling? So it could be airplane, it could be bus, train, something like that. Okay, I had one. And so I travel a lot, and oftentimes on the plane, I am that typical person who would probably put in headphones and take a little nap and have time for quiet reflection. Well, I was on a plane headed to San Francisco for the AAC&U 21st Century event in February. And it was not until we were about maybe 30 minutes away from landing, there were 3 seats. I was in the window seat. The middle seat was open, so it was a great flight. It was coming all the way from DC. It was a long way to go with a lot more leg room. It was great. And it just turns out that there was a woman on the aisle seat who saw that I was reading, something about, higher education. She said, well, what field are you in? I said, well, I work with a lot of people who work on college campuses. I'm actually headed to a conference to talk about comprehensive learning and basically what happens outside the classroom. And she said, well, that's interesting because I'm a teacher and I have my students working on e-portfolios. I said, really? And so at that point, we only had 30 minutes left for the conversation, but we had a great time. And she made this quote that I actually put in the slides back 5 months ago. And she said, it's really all about the intentionality of learning. What are the odds that we would have had that conversation? So I'm kicking myself thinking, man, I shouldn't have had the headphones in so early. We could have had a great conversation. I would have been that one who nagged her the whole way to San Francisco. But instead, what happened is that we resolved that we would exchange business cards. We've probably done that 1,000 times, but you never actually called. Well, I called her. And so basically, over the last 5 months, we've stayed in touch. And I've started to pick her brain and ask a lot of questions because I thought about it. I was like, well, if we have students coming in college as freshmen, sophomores, returning adults, and we're for the first time introducing to them the use of e-portfolios, if she's doing this with 8th graders, imagine what could happen to connect that journey intentionally. So an 8th grader who has no work experience and probably not old enough to actually have a job that would have them working routinely, but if they are able to put things in the e-portfolio, imagine what it would be like by the time they get to us in college. And so I just have been fascinated with this. So I asked her a ton of questions, probably way more than she wanted to answer, about who she's working with on the campus, what types of technology do they use, how does she convince students that they should want to do this, and you'd be probably not so surprised that some of the same themes that are happening in K-12 are the same ones that we're talking about in higher ed. And so I'll share a couple quotes with you to set up this first action. 5 months later, today, she said, we encourage them to really look beyond grades and think about the assignments that showcase the learner that they are becoming, or they have become. And so I put that part in pink because I feel like at the core, that's what we'd like to happen with an e-portfolio experience or some other integrated nature of where a student would go across the campus. And so it's perfect timing. A good example of this, I would say, is the University of South Carolina. So they have what's called Beyond the Classroom Matters. It's not exactly an e-portfolio project per se, but they've set up the infrastructure such that if they wanted to create an e-portfolio, they could. And so they coined it Beyond the Classroom Matters because this is a quote taken directly from their website. They say that students are the author of their USC experience. Basically, how they choose to engage is up to them, but it matters for their learning and for their success. And so to tell you about the features of what they created, they actually didn't start off with the end in mind. They didn't start off saying we want to actually have a record, a digital record. Instead, they said they want to just start off by cataloging all the different types of experiences and opportunities that a student at South Carolina could take advantage of. And so before they knew it, they had 300 or 400 of them. And they put them into a very simple setup. It was really just to kind of catalog what's available. And then from there, they said, what if we could actually make that publicly available to students, have them register for those opportunities, kind of like registering for a class. They tried that worked out. Next semester, they said, what if we could track which students were signing up for which things? So then they started to connect demographic data to that. And then they said, well, what if we could track their participation in it? So they signed up for it, we're attaching it to their ID card. Now we can see how many hours of all these things are doing. Now, I don't know if maybe they chose to do this homegrown approach because they didn't want to go with the vendor, but the point is they got to customize it and make it what they wanted. And then they got to the place of saying, now that we have all this information, what could we give back to the student in a digital format to showcase everything they've been doing across the campus for a couple years? And so that's where they are right now. Still looking to refine it, still looking to turn it into something that students would really want, but they've coined it Beyond the Classroom Matters and actually provided what's called graduation with leadership distinction. So if you're a USC student and you've been doing a lot and you've been populating this record, at the end of your time at USC, when it's time to leave, you get a special cord, you get special recognition. It's called graduation with leadership distinction. And after a certain number of semesters and hours, they actually get to take that with them, along with the record. So it becomes a really good lever for change on the campus. So action number 2, I'd say intentionally connecting learning across experiences. That's not new. I mean, we're at the ABLE conference. All of you knew that already. But again, I'm describing relationships, partnerships, and priorities. So the first one I thought was between professionals and the student. This one I would say specifically the relationship I want to highlight is faculty and student affairs. It's kind of like the relationship between IT and IR, my other favorite topics to talk about. We both have skin in the game. We both want the same outcomes for students. We definitely can at times have siloed roles, but I think the breaking down of the silos and more of the merging is where we're heading. In student affairs, I've seen a lot of movement. Some campuses deciding to merge student affairs with academic affairs. I don't have a position per se on that. I know where I work, and so some would say your position, Amelia, should be that student affairs stays separate. I would say more often than not, I'm asked that question, I find that the solution is not in the org structure, the solution is in the intentionality of the function. So however that plays out, however it's housed, that would probably be my first choice. The partnership aspect is that basically any functions that are influencing the learner experience, I think there's an opportunity for partnership there. And then lastly, it's the priority to connect specific language and consistent language about how and when and where learning can occur. All right, second poll, last poll. Does your campus offer on-campus work opportunities to students? Okay, so of those who have your hand raised, how many of you initially thought federal work study? Probably so. I would love to tell you that we did a recent study. This is a shameless plug here, so I'm going to insert some research that I've not yet shared with this audience of folks in assessment. Some research on campus employment, specifically to not necessarily negate the benefits of federal work study, but instead expand the conversation. So we knew that there were a lot of campuses that were hiring students, but it's easy to think of it as, oh, we have a federal work study student, or a student who's doing administrative capacity support for us, and they're funded by federal work study. That's actually the nuance I'd like to describe. So it's not uncommon to have a student work across the campus in various functions, and the payment for their work would come from federal work study dollars, but there are a lot. We're talking like on average maybe hundreds of positions on a campus, you probably know this, that are not funded out of federal work study. And the opportunities federal work study plus these to leverage them to pull out valuable skills and competencies is tremendous. And so happy to share, I think back in January or February, I said that we were working on this and the report was coming soon. Well, the report is out now. That's it. It's a picture of it. If you were to Google NASPA plus student employment, you come up with this resource, and another one I'll share later. The goals of the work were really just to identify what are the pieces that make up a robust on-campus student employment program, how does that play out differently by size and sector of institution, and what are some of the effective practices that campuses are using. And so what we did was we started off with a lot of interviews. We talked to campus leaders, practitioners across the campus, student affairs, functional units, business office, HR. All of these actually have students that work there and not doing just truly administrative, answering phones and filing papers type things. We did 5 campus visits. We did a community college. We did a large public, small private. Found a lot of good things. If you look at the end for our national survey of 244, you'd be like, that's not that many. But if I tell you they answered a 45-minute survey, then the 244 we feel pretty good about. So we got a lot of information, and it definitely connects with what I want to share with you here. So you're probably thinking, what were the purposes, for the purposes of the research, what were the definitions of student employee? So we couldn't necessarily include everything. So the things that were in scope is that if a student was enrolled at least half-time, we would say that counts for the purpose of the research. If they were employed by the institution, that counts. So there are some institutions that have a company housed on the campus, so they might have a call center, and the students work on campus, but they work for another company, we would exclude those. If they're employed on a part-time basis, we included them. We know that there are some students who probably work in excess, close to full-time, but this is not exactly what I'd say is the effective practice, so we excluded those. They should at least receive hourly wages. So we know there's some positions that would be paid in housing or something non-monetary. We were looking specifically at those who got some type of dollar value in return. They should be supervised by institution staff, and that basically the position should be located on campus. And so that's what was in scope. What was out of scope was graduate students. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't know that GAs are there, but we really want to focus on the undergraduate student experience. Again, I mentioned that third-party vendors or private vendors, we didn't include those. Full-time employees at the institution who were also enrolled as students, we excluded those, and so on and so forth. So I won't read them all to you, but the point is, at this place, we figured out that there were several categories, 5 categories of the ideal student experience. And so to create clear goals and set expectations, to provide mentorship. So I'll stop there and say, that's the connection back when I said there's a relationship between the professional and the student. There are several instances where the student focus groups that we did, they said that the best part of the whole experience for them was that they had a dedicated mentor, somebody who could tell them about where they were going on their educational journey and coach them, advise them on what to do next. Plenty of opportunities for reflection, that mentor-mentee relationship coming at least probably multiple times per week. It reiterates the process of reflection and learning. And so you probably can see where I'm going with this. If this is like a hidden gem, but not so hidden, it's been in plain sight the whole time, this is a great opportunity to I'd say, surface all of what the student is doing into an e-portfolio or other record. And so it's a great opportunity to acknowledge and document learning, growth over time. Because these are positions that we know students will show up for each week, you kind of get around that conversation that we see in student affairs a lot, which is what if the student decides they want to do it on Monday, but then don't show up, or they don't do it semester to semester. So student employment on campus, even from a standpoint of what a student would get out of it, is just a tremendous upside here. So We took the research and divided it into 5 capacity areas. I won't read all of them to you. Some of them not necessarily is connected to this talk, but I'd say the purple box is the one I'll hone in on before moving to the third critical action. So when we surveyed the campuses and did the interviews, we asked them, of these kind of 5 categories, which ones do you feel are the strongest? So naturally, hiring processes and policies, those are strong. Whenever you have a formal contractual arrangement, that should be in place pretty effectively. Similarly, they said that the leadership and engagement of the process was pretty strong. When we asked them, how have you been describing student learning outcomes? Only about 20% of them said they had made it that far. Now, the ones that did said they used actually the AAC&U resources, so that's positive. But the other one said they have not thought about it intentionally, not because they don't want to, it's just because they've actually just been doing it in a more transactional way. So I think of that as a huge upside for us. I could easily see a perfect connection between the ePortfolio and student employment on campus, and here's why. When we asked them, what are the overall goals for your student employment program? Naturally, the things you would see on there would probably be to build a connection to campus, improve their financial security. Naturally, the money lever is going to be a strong play. But to have 42% of them say that they want to enhance student learning is actually a really good thing. And so they're moving in the right direction. They have the resource in place. They have the opportunities available. And I think that combination of all 3 would make student employment a tremendous experiential learning opportunity. So this is just one of the slides, one of the findings and figures from the report. Several more in there if you want to see it. And we also, kind of a companion piece to the report, created an institutional self-assessment rubric. So for instance, if you came to this conference, this seems interesting to you, I'll certainly be glad to chat with you after and connect you to some campuses. But if you said, hey, I think I got enough of a push here, Amelia's convinced me that we really want to try to look at student employment as a connection to the ePortfolio, but you're curious about where to start, we have done some of the legwork for you and created a 6-component rubric that you could take and sit down with colleagues and just answer some questions. And so in the area of student learning outcomes, you'll see different practices in there, a way to self-rate yourself. It's not intended to be a certain threshold of score to say you're doing well or not, so much as it is opportunities for you to strengthen or expand your program. So it has a 4-point rating scale. We don't really like the middle, but at the end of it, it provides suggestions for an ideal student employment experience. And so I won't read all of them, but I'll focus specifically on student learning outcomes. So the 3 areas of the rubric we'd ask, do you actually have a learning framework? How do you actually identify institution-wide student learning outcomes as a result of the employment opportunity? So from there, reflection and learning. What are going to be the things that student employees can use to evaluate and document what they've been learning over the course of their employment? And then the third, because it's practical, what's the place where the relationship between the mentor and the mentee results in constant and effective feedback for the student? And so these are just 3 examples of what's in the rubric in the area of student learning outcomes. So I feel like I could not really explain enough to you why I feel like this is just a gem. So if you're thinking of one takeaway, I hope all the actions I share are be ones that you take back. But I really do think that student employment on campus is one of the next big things. So the action number 3 that I'd like to mention here is communicating the utility and the value of experiential learning early and often. So in student affairs, there are a number of professionals who work in orientation. And I'd probably say they're the ones who say most often, please don't ask me for another thing. If not them, probably the assessment professionals. Assessment because it's like everybody wants some type of data and some type of information collected. Orientation because they've been told, you know what we should do? We should put a booth up during orientation and give students all the information they need about this, and this. And so I think what has happened here is that we've flooded students with information and they're not necessarily able to decipher off which pieces they should know right now and decipher which pieces they need to know right now and which pieces they need to know for later. As a result, the flooding probably is at high level when they first get there, probably tapers off a little bit after they've been there for a semester or 2, and then near the end, it picks back up again. Here's what you need to know before you graduate. Here's what you need to know when you're starting to apply for a job. And so I would say early and often, the relationship is between the institution and the learner. So we've done relationships between professionals and the student, relationships between functional units, but I wanted to also mention that there is a relationship between the institution and the learner. We want to say that those would be our future alumni who'd be willing to give back to the institution or possibly give a quote about what the Bronx Community College experience was like for them. It requires a partnership among offices that have any opportunity to communicate with learners frequently, or not so frequently, but at all. And then lastly, the priority is to create a culture of sustained, continuous, integrated, authentic learning. That's a lot of descriptors, but basically, we have probably said for decades, that students have had this type of integrated, authentic learning experience. We probably offered it within student affairs for decades, the idea that student affairs would be educators and that we would be the ones to help facilitate this. But in terms of the messaging to students, I don't know that we've actually refined that enough. So I'll insert a shameless plug here and tell you that the next research project that we just started about 3 months ago is to specifically look at communication of how student affairs divisions send information to students. And so I have this hunch. How many of you have heard this phrase that students don't read their email? I actually think they do read the email. I think the challenge is not that they don't read it, it's that they get so many messages of multiple types trying to, again, decipher which things should they take action on, which things are just FYI. And so we've started to interview a lot of student affairs divisions and ask them the tactical things, like how do you actually determine at what point the message goes out? So who has to see it? Is there a process for triaging? Second, which actions do you want the student to take immediately? Which one should be taken later? And how does the email communication let them know what they should do and when? So we've been finding some interesting things. Some campuses actually have sophisticated dashboards that they use. They manage with a team. Others say that they are the sole person. They can email all students at any time they want to. And so I really do think that this communicating early and often is going to be a place where we could have great movement. So second and final quote from my airplane passenger friend, I asked her a question about advice. I said, well, I'm about to talk to a group of professionals who are working on e-portfolios at the college level. What advice would you offer them? And she said, well, I don't really know that I have a lot of advice. I haven't done it in that experience type setting. But what she said was, as long as, she said, I'd tell you to tell them, as long as they keep in mind that the portfolio should not seem random, then I think they'll be fine. Like basically not even in a college environment, especially not in a college environment. This portfolio experience should not seem like a random thing. It should seem like a part of the everyday experience for a student at their institution. And I think that sets up this communication early and often. Good example of it, I would say, is the University of Central Oklahoma. I've talked about them before. They have what's called the Central Six. And so if you were to go to the campus, similar to how the CUNY ASAP posters and billboards are around here, as soon as you step foot on the campus, you're going to see something that says the UCO Central Six. So every student, from the time they get there and first participate in orientation, all the way through advising, career advising, in the classroom, up to graduation, they know that there are 6 categories that they should be working on at all times. And they actually have a record that they would populate that with. And so if you look at numbers 1 through 5, a lot of those could happen anywhere, in any capacity. But then they also combine that with discipline-specific knowledge and competencies. So the idea is it creates the holistic nature and that any one of the students at UCO should have a tremendous number of opportunities to populate their record, which is called the Stellar, so the Student Transformative Learning Record, with a lot of activities and coaching built around that and advising through it for them to populate and address around the Central Six. And so communicating that early and often has not really been that easy for them. They did admit that trying to get students to see the value in it early on was kind of like, this should be just, I got time to do it. And so they've worked really, really hard to be intentional with their messaging and communication strategies to do this early and often. So I think I probably have about 5 more minutes of conversation before I want to see if any of you have questions, but I couldn't resist offering a bonus action. So I said I had 3, but I actually have 4. And this one's going to be a little bit cheesy just because I'm cheesy like that. The 4th one is to remember the balance of needs, process, and outcomes. And so I had a great conversation at dinner with Susan, and I don't know that Susan knew I was going to put her on the spot, but we talked about outcomes and why there's a great temptation to only focus on outcomes. But I see why. Accreditors, they probably care about how you did things. They care about the need that you're trying to address, but they still want you to report on certain outcomes. I imagine if the federal government asked you to give your data related to iPads and you said, well, we don't really care about the outcomes of working on needs and process, you probably would not have a satisfactory answer for them. And so what I've come up with is that this idea that the balance between the 3 is what's at stake here. And so in my field of study, all the research I've done with institutions, many of them will lead with outcomes, and they should. But I think effective outcomes assessment builds on a foundation of needs assessment and process assessment. So basically what I'm trying to suggest is, and you know what a needs assessment is, you know what a process assessment is, but if you don't adequately address those 2 things, the outcomes assessment would not be as strong as it needs to be. So just to kind of drive home this very, very, I think, profound way of describing it, I'm going to give you a cheesy example. So on the left, that's my plant, Verde. I'm very proud of this. It's because I don't have really a green thumb. The irony is that I grew up on a farm in rural Lake City, Florida, growing with my family all manner of crops. So vegetables, cucumbers, squash, tomatoes, watermelon, cantaloupe, you name it, all of that. We had cows and chickens and a whole bunch of stuff. So I should be able to grow a succulent plant, one that only requires watering every 2 weeks. But it was very difficult. And so he was really small when I first got him about a year ago, and he started to outgrow the pot. And so that meant at some point I had to repot it. And I was very nervous. I thought it was an indicator of my ability to keep a living thing in the house. And so I did what any researcher would do. I got on Google and said best soil for a succulent plant, best pots to put a succulent plant in, way to move a succulent plant from one pot to the next. And after all this research, someone came over to visit and said, oh, your plant looks great. I see the green leaves. I was like, but you don't know all the work that it took to get to those green leaves. Have you noticed the pot? And they were like, yeah, it looks nice. I'm thinking, but do you notice the soil that's in this pot? And they completely would all pass all that stuff. And so I'm making the analogy that a successful plant growing experience is the result of watering and pruning, and the process, but I'd say the process, and knowing how to give appropriate attention to the plant's needs. And so you see the green leaves, that's the outcome. But without the adequate reminder in my phone every 2 weeks that says, don't forget to water Verde, which is the process, and also the need, knowing what type of soil to put it in and type of pot, that outcome would never have happened. And so I think that if my advice to you is if you're looking at your ePortfolio experience, you've been doing it for a couple years, and some have asked, are the outcomes there? Are certain student populations using this the way that you think they should be? Are faculty adopting it the way that it should be? Do you think student affairs collaborations are happening the way that they should be? And if the answer is not quite, not yet, I'm not sure, don't be quick to toss it out. Don't dismiss the value of the ePortfolio. It truly may be that the need and the process need to be reassessed, because the tweaking of those two things, I think, provide the strongest foundation. I'm certain that the ePortfolio is the high impact practice that we need to have. If it's not producing the results or the outcomes you want just yet, go back to the needs and the process outcomes. I just really think that's going to be the sweet spot. All right, so I got some predictions, 4 of them, about the future of experiential learning. And then from here, I'll give you some resources and see if we have questions. I think that we will be in a position to leverage data in greater detail to describe which learning environments are helping students thrive and at which points in their academic journey. I think that we're going to get more sophisticated. We have a lot of technology vendors that are going to partner with us. I think the capacity of IR and IE, institutional assessment, is going to get stronger and stronger. And so the nuance of our discussions is going to be even greater. And so I think we started off with the premise in higher ed that we want to serve all students, especially those from certain priority backgrounds. But I think we're going to go farther than that. It's not going to be just what can you do for an African-American student who's a second-year business major, but instead for a second-year African-American student within a 100-mile radius of home, what would you do with them for an on-campus experience? And so I think that's where we're heading. It's going to be a tremendous upside, I think, in the next 3 to 5 years at the longest. The second is we're going to become more skilled at measuring learning that happens in co-curricular environments. Every session I've been to at the NASPA conference that talks about this, many of them have said we've been doing this for years. We just needed a little bit more structure around the frameworks we select. And so many of them said that they use AAC&U a lot. Even for the ones that had their own framework that they've created from scratch, they've been very intentional about saying we have to have this now. We can't go on as business as usual. And so that's going to make us more sophisticated and more knowledgeable and precise in how we look at co-curricular engagement, specifically on-campus work as a starting place. Third, and this is a bold one, I think we're going to have some new collaborations. You probably say, what does the business office and what does the advancement office have to do with this conversation? I talked with a campus that had an idea that maybe if they wanted to create a space for all students to actually engage in co-curricular learning, that they might provide a business proposition. Like basically, what types of new relationships would they find with community partners in the area to provide those activities? And so if that ends up being a revenue stream, I can see the business office being included or interested in that. Some campuses have said they want to create a fundraising opportunity. So basically, what could they do for the students who can't afford to go and do study abroad? Might they have a special fund that alum could actually contribute to, or that students themselves might want to contribute to? And so as a result, they're creating greater capacity for students to be involved. I just really want to hit this microphone. Greater experiences for all students to participate. So I see the advancement office saying, actually, if you do want to do that, let's create the structure for that. So I really think the new collaboration between the business office and the advancement office, in addition to student affairs, academic affairs, and others, is going to be on the rise. And then lastly, the result of all of this, because I told you I lean toward the student-focused perspective, we're going to be resourceful, responsible, and reliable to the students we serve. I think we wouldn't have the ABLE conference if you all didn't come with that same mindset, and I think that's only going to increase in the years ahead. So I promised you some resources. The first is one I just found. So Natasha Jankowski, I don't know if she's in here right now, but she's going to be with you, I think, tomorrow. Is it tomorrow? She shared with me this resource. I don't think it's going to be in her slides, so I'm not spoiling it. But it's a report that's looking at student success. I say often in other presentations I've done that a lot of campuses are moving toward this notion of student success, either as a mission, as a functional unit, as an office, as a personal profession. Basically, the student success movement is here. And so this report from the Higher Learning Commission talks about if you have a student success agenda, here's how you can approach that from a data framework. So it's a really, really great publication. Pretty quick read. I think you can get through it in about an hour, but it's excellent. And then lastly, I would say the part I told you about the University of Central Oklahoma and the University of South Carolina, those are two campuses that are part of the Comprehensive Learner Record Project that NASPA is doing with ACRO, which is the Registrar and Admissions Officers Association. So you can easily Google any of these, and the slides are available. Tracy will make those available to you. So two really good publications. I think we are at right about the time for if there are any questions, and then we have a microphone here. My friend that I'm recording this for, should I keep this on? Yes, keep it on? Okay, I'll keep it on. I've told you a lot. Any questions? Oh, you mind? Do you have a question?
Well, I have a mic.
Okay, you have a mic.
I do have questions.
Okay.
I'd rather defer to my colleagues. Anybody?
Is there one?
Maybe I can.
You want to kick us off?
I am fascinated by everything that you brought up. It's almost like you brought forth and shown us what would seem to me to be like an educational dream that one has sometimes. When you've had a really good day and you go home and you fall asleep and you think,
that's what this felt like.
this is the wonderful world that we can have. And I'm thinking about specifically, just to make it a little more specific, thinking about all of those different units on a campus coming together, collaborating in a way that I think to me is fascinating and logical at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I am the ePortfolio coordinator here, and I have ePortfolio mentors who work with us, and it is so easily to just think of them as I need an ePortfolio mentor to help our students, to provide student support. But to look at it in the way that you're proposing, which is very smart, and here we are in CUNY, we keep talking about, just like in SUNY, about experiential learning,
mm-hmm.
and how are we going to do that? And yet, we've had the students engaging in that type of productive work all along.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there anything that you can speak to, like specifics where a success story of units really, truly collaborating, and can you give us a suggestion on how to encourage and overcome those boundaries and break down the siloing enough to allow for this type of true collaboration?
Yeah. This is a great question. If that warm feeling happened from the slides, I have to make sure I can get that on the quote. Is this recording going to be close to what he said in terms of it being that warm and fuzzy feeling? In terms of what the challenges might be, I'll call out a couple things. I think anytime you're making the suggestion of multiple units working together, first thing somebody's going to say is, if everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. So at some point, who's going to lead this? And so I think some of the things that promote or push people into silos is that I know that I can control this set of outcomes. I know that my colleague can control this set. And if I'm accountable to what I have to do, my colleague's accountable to what they have to do, that makes things easier. I think the first piece of what I find works is probably outside the realm of just what we can do individually. You'd have to have someone who's responsible for the ePortfolio effort pushing for the idea that silos are functional, but they're not the most effective for efficiency, which is my second point. I think that to work together, you cover more ground more quickly. And so I think we were in the car ride back to the hotel last night, and I said one of the things that I see most often break down in the creation of records like this is actually not the technology. It's not actually the data. It's not the capacity to have people work on it, but it's the shared mindset about what the end goal is. And so if you can get to that point, the turning point for that, everything else kind of falls in place. I can give you an example of what I think collaboration across functional units could be like and why we should do it. And it's actually not an ePortfolio example, it's an enrollment management example. And so I'd say if we go back 15, 20 years, you would have an enrollment manager on a campus whose primary function is to predict about how many students you need to offer admission to, how many of those students need to accept, how many of those students need to stay toward graduation. And that person would work with the finance office to say, this is about how much revenue we bring in based on tuition and fees, if this prediction is right. It was one of the most high demand roles on my campus. It still is, because when in declining budgets, you want somebody who can use data and say, this is what I think we should probably do in terms of constructing a new class of students. We have moved to keep that model, but what has changed is that we're now bringing in additional people. So the financial aid office, for example, is at the table when they're doing their projections, because you want to know how many students to enroll that have a certain financial capability and what you should be offering them in terms of financial aid very early on in order to keep them all the way through to graduation. Student affairs previously wasn't involved in that conversation, but I find more VPs of student affairs saying, actually, I have enrollment management in my portfolio, and I'm also at the table. So I would imagine it as the groups working together to prepare a meal for a guest who's coming, the meal being the college experience, the student being the guest. One option could be have the student show up, they sit down, and we say, prepared a meal for you, hope you like it, which is kind of like, okay, we knew you were coming, here's what we have to offer. The other is to reach out to them in advance and say, do you have any dietary restrictions? Do you have any favorite foods? What are the things that you'd like to have at certain courses of the meal? And so if you can't have the student at the table with you, we should at least be prepared to offer a variety of things. Are we ready, using the same analogy, to provide a vegan option or a vegetarian option, something like that? So I think to get to where we are with enrollment management, it was not overnight. I think many campuses would say, I don't need to have all these other hands involved. I've been doing enrollment management for a long time. Not that they were, just curmudgeons about it, but it's a routine siloed function. The walls around that function have truly, come down. I think the collaborative nature of that is a great example of what we could do in an ePortfolio environment. So that's a long answer and an analogy, but I hope that connects to what you're saying. So, yeah, sure.
So I love this idea of the value proposition for students and the focusing on the needs and the processes, not just the outcomes. And this is sort of a follow-up to what you were just talking about. What do you see as the student-identified needs when it comes to experiential learning or ePortfolios? Because I think of my students, especially thinking about 8th grade through college, like first-year students versus when they're at the end, thinking about it, it's very, very different. Like a first-year student, they're kind of wondering who they are, exploring their identity. So their needs are very different. So I'm just curious what you have seen, like from a student affairs perspective, perhaps, about the student needs and processes that they want to see.
Yep. I think at the core, what they need, so you gave the example of the early in their career student who needs to figure out who they are. That same thing happens when you're a professional out in the workforce. Who am I? What's my purpose in life? You get to be a certain milestone age. Is this a career that I thought I would have? In terms of core needs, I think students, for sure, they need to have a structure and mechanism by which they can take classes, complete experiences. That part we can actually program. We can get that together. I think what they need is decision support. The same way professionals need decision support with data, students need resources like an ePortfolio to help them make decisions. And I think the way that we can construct an ePortfolio experience is that along the way, we intentionally coach them on how to put the pieces together, and basically to convince them or assure them that basically they're not making steps that are going to just ruin their career. You'd be surprised the number of graduate students even that say, I think I chose the right major, but I'm not quite sure. I think I want to go into this field, but I'm not sure yet. I imagine an ePortfolio, if done in a way that's very holistic and of course has a coaching or mentoring element built into it, could show them that maybe they're an art history major, but they have an affinity for numbers. It might be that we show them how to manage procurement for a museum, something like that. So if they have experiences doing certain types of internships and things like that, and they just see that as one item that they've done, but they're still not sure if they want to be an art history major. I think what they really need is a structure and a process and the resources that we hold, us being a little bit more seasoned, to help them make the decisions they need to make at certain points. So we can't give them all the right answers, and regardless of what we tell them, they're going to have a variety of options in front of them. But I think the greatest need is for this price point of college right now and the pressure of trying to find a job, they need something that can provide to them an assurance that all the steps they're taking, whatever directions they are, can still get them to the path of fulfillment that they want to reach. And so that feels very philosophical in terms of my answer, but I hope that creates enough flexibility that regardless of where we are in the ePortfolio experience, it at the end of the day provides a value to the student to say, hey, if I do this, I'm going to have greater clarity about where I am in my own professional and educational journey. And so they'll be able to see that much more early on. So if they're a first-year student or if they're closer to the end of their career, they won't feel as though they're not making the progress that they want to. So that's my humble opinion. Okay, we got one here, we got one here, we got one here.
I'm going to swing over to the second thing.
Okay.
Plus, ePortfolio is a process.
Yes, it is.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk.
You're
Could you talk a little bit more, given your role at NASPA and student affairs, about what you see with the crossover of student affairs and academic affairs? I know that's a challenge on a lot of campuses.
Yep. So there was probably a good handful, maybe 5 to 10 campuses 3 or 4 years ago that actually formally merged the two functions together. And so that created a bit of a stir. Got a lot of calls from VPs saying, hey, is this on the horizon? Is this something I should be concerned about? A lot of student affairs professionals wondering if their roles are going to get folded into a different hierarchy and structure. That didn't take off to a great degree the way that some thought. I mean, that's going to happen, but there are other, I'd say, environmental things that lead to that. So I actually I don't think that the relationship between student affairs and academic affairs would be contentious to the point of one acquiring the other. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think the campuses that did that had to take a fresh look at their finances and their projected revenues going forward and trying to become more lean. That also is not me describing it as administrative bloat or any of those things. It's just truly the way that they were doing their business models, it worked out for them to do that. But I have not seen the upsurge continue the way that some thought, like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling. I think that the biggest places where academic affairs and student affairs have been collaborating now is, number one, in the area of advising. And so I think we've seen models where previously you'd have a student go to an academic advising center, probably first year, second year, and then third and fourth year, they spend more time with faculty. We've had more campuses now tell us they're trying to do an integrated approach. So maybe you have, even from the first year, a team of advisors. Some do the more centralized process of doing advising. Others do it in a more decentralized way. The second area I would say is actually in basic needs. Academic affairs and student affairs previously weren't having these conversations. Many other functions weren't either. I've talked about this at a previous conference. The issues of hunger, homelessness, mental health, all things that relate to health and well-being of students. I've seen a tremendous surge in the number of campuses that say they want student affairs to help explain to others around. We want faculty to help provide the continuous messaging. So I've seen things that are tactical as faculty putting information in the syllabus about the availability of resources. I've also seen student affairs divisions talk about telecounseling or counseling in other domains outside of just the health and wellness center. So I think on the side of org structure, I don't think that the future of that is going to be that student affairs and academic affairs will be merging. I mean, it probably could happen, but I don't think we'll see that as a future activity. I think in the area of advising, because it's a critical function now, back to what I was saying about helping students make decisions, that advising function is going to probably be the next area that the two have to work together. I think an emerging area that will have great return will be health and well-being and how faculty and student affairs can work together to that end. You're welcome. All right, so we had here, then had here.
I have a comment and question.
Okay.
So I'm really excited about the 8th grade teachers.
Yeah, I am too.
Because I think part of the problem is the distinction between educating and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote that you have about students helping them understand how to showcase the learner they become. And if students have that understanding of what learning means,
Yep.
and they're on this journey and they think, oh, I have to showcase what I'm learning. And ePortfolio is like self-evident.
Yeah.
Right? This of course would help me do that. So it would save a lot of trouble here.
It would.
And my question is, I really liked the framing of collaboration as a lever for teams. And one thing about collaboration is it's very hard and messy. And I teach on a team, so there's 3 faculty that
Yeah.
teach class every day. And there's a lot of ego, and there's a lot of different ways that people have ownership of information and which they want to go forth. And so I think one of the pieces that might be helpful for making all this work more quick the trainings about how to collaborate, just having the process piece of this is what it means to work in collaboration. And are those trainings happening in these places?
Mm-hmm. Are the trainings around collaboration happening? I haven't seen very many. I think that when I made the point earlier that current trends in experiential learning is that we find more employers wanting colleagues that have transferable skills. Collaboration is one of those transferable skills that we don't see presented very often, but it's necessary. So I think we're all working on it. I think we have a backdoor way into collaboration. We have discussions like how to have a difficult conversation with your colleague, which is not exactly labeled as collaboration, but it's a facet of it. How to build strong teams if I'm a leader and I want to have a team. But I don't know that I've seen any directly called collaboration. I've learned some things along the way, as someone who leads a team of 12 of I'm going to brag and say they're some of the best colleagues I've ever had. It's never going to be a simple mix. And all of you, if you've ever been a part of a team, people are motivated by different things. Some want the visible recognition. Others want the opportunity in the spotlight. Some never want to be in the spotlight. Others just want to feel like whatever they've contributed is actually being used. And so I think I'd probably resolve that last point, that anybody who's a part of a collaborative effort, as long as they see the value proposition for doing it and an opportunity that their contributions will still be visible, I think they'll stay. Figuring out the frequency of that is probably up to whoever's leading the effort. So it is messy. It is difficult. To your earlier point about this quote and the one before, one of the first questions I asked Cindy was, what do you do with an 8th grader who doesn't have a job? Like, what types of activities would they put in an e-portfolio, and how would you convince them to keep doing it? And what they said was, this is the perfect time for them because they don't have the pressure of a job and having to put things on there for the purpose of attaining a job. So she said they do all types of things. Some of them are active volunteers. Some of them are doing things in the community. Some of them have started their own small businesses like cutting grass and things like that. So they figured out how to tease out the skills and competencies from those type experiences into an e-portfolio. So I don't have an answer about specific training on collaboration. It'd be a worthwhile resource though. But we have first cousins to that, so to speak. But thank you for the comment. All right, we got you.
Hi, thank you.
Hey.
When it comes to validating co-curricular learning, I'm wondering what kind of variations you're seeing across campuses in terms of what students are being asked to provide, who's reviewing and deciding, and what we can learn about how students are navigating and accessing.
Yeah, I think that connects to my point earlier about exposure versus immersion. So for student affairs, not every experience is going to end up being validated. I think Elon University is probably one of the best examples of that. So before the movement toward documenting co-curricular engagements happened, Elon was doing it. And their co-curricular transcript looked kind of like this. I got my little thank you notes on here. But it looked like what you would see in a regular academic transcript. Service, 5 hours, date. Leadership, 2 hours, date. And it was fine for the purpose of giving a transactional record of what students had done, but there was no evidence of learning, and there was no framework, built around that. So they quickly started to get into those conversations. And I think that is what led to them saying, well, maybe not everything in the student's experience needs to be measured because it's not going to be enough there to actually do it. Now, if you're talking about a 15 weeks on-campus student employment experience, I'll use that for example, if that's where I hope we're heading. You have all types of stuff that can be measured. There are going to be formal assessments of the student's job performance. So at Clemson, they have an example of a student who worked in the recreation center. And so basically, as a part of working in that job, they had to pass certain competencies in order to be at the front desk. Like, do you know how to operate the money transactional thing? Do you know how to actually make a request if something breaks down? And so those are not necessarily specific things you see written on the documentable record, but you'd probably say, does the person know how to manage logistics? Are they able to effectively communicate? Now, they would probably need to have some type of framework. I imagine the value rubrics are there. I find that most student affairs professionals who are trying to get to the place of measuring learning are starting with an existing resource, many of which come from AAC&U. Now, there's going to be a difference between direct and indirect measures. A direct measure like a test versus indirect with student reports, what they've learned, self-reflection. I don't think that there's a leaning one way to the other, but I think what's going to happen is that there has to be some of that in order for it to make it into the record. So I think within student affairs, if they're at 100%, everything goes into it, 0% would be nothing. I think we're going to be about 50-50. Not everything that a student would do will end up being measured, but for those that are, I think we'll see many of the AAC&U resources being used more often than not. Thank you for the question. Got time for one more. No pressure.
So my question is a little bit different. It's going to circle back to student employment.
Oh, good.
I too am a fellow student affairs person.
Yay.
How do you mentor positions that, for example, you're working at the library checking out books or at the fitness center checking people? How do you mentor that? How do you scaffold that experience?
How do you scaffold the experience so that it becomes a learning opportunity?
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, I don't know about a library example, but I can give you something that relates to publications, for example. So I know a campus that has like a magazine. People are still using tangible hard copy stuff, but even if it's digital, the idea is that you'd have the student employees doing everything from conducting the interviews for the features that are going to go into it, to also learning about the backing out the number of weeks that it would take to get it into production. So they may not be the ones that are actually doing the final editing. I think you might have an English faculty member or someone in the faculty that actually looks over the final product, but the collection of the data would be something they would do. The taking of the pictures that go along with the articles is something they would do. They would collaborate with the faculty member on the editing of it, so they see how that process works. They would be involved in managing the number of copies that go out. This is a real example. They would also be involved with the communication of it on the website. So doing the email draft thing, working the social media piece of it. So I think that there are multiple entry points. In that example, it wasn't just one student. So they had a team of students and they only produced the publication like twice a year. But the whole process from start to finish, project management is a part of that too. And so what they do is they create a kind of weekly checklist. And so each week there's a certain set of skills and competencies they hope the student would pick up. And so maybe week 1 is just truly project management. So laying out the work plan and who's going to be responsible. By the time they get to the end or halfway through, what's going to be the communications plan? So they're picking up skill sets on specifically like how to construct a suite all the way up to how to segment which people get which messages at which time. All of this is built around a system of advisors and mentors. So it's not like they just say, hey, here's what you got to do, go off and do it, come back with your best suggestion. But instead, it's a partnership between, again, some faculty who might be doing the proofreading, some people who might work in the communications department, working on the actual production of it and releasing it, stuff like that. So somebody from the arts department who might work on the pictures and the visual display of it. So at all those touch points, there is definitely the opportunity to say, okay, I want you to do these 4 things, get back to me next week. But more often than not, if done well, it turns into, well, what ideas do you have? What kind of pictures do you think would go well with this particular story? Where might we go get those pictures and can you take some? And so the process is much more helping, again, the students see, to the collaboration point, see whatever piece of that process they're contributing to fits into the larger whole. And so I think a lot of the students in that experience, when they saw their finished work actually in printed format, they liked it a lot. So I think it kept it going to a great degree. So not a one size fits all, but I think along the way, having a structured plan that works out pretty well. Because again, taking on even more than 2, on-campus students would be a large lift, but if structured appropriately, it could happen. You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to pass the mic back to Tracy.
Great. Well, Amelia, thank you so much. One of the things that we wanted to do over the last couple of years is to engage other stakeholder groups in talking to us and other partners in talking to us at ABLE about how we might do our work. And student affairs is such a logical connection that I think often, at least for me as somebody in academic affairs, there's often that disconnect or that siloing that happens. So thank you so much for sharing these great.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.